is Helen Kahaso-Dena. That's the project lead Pan-Africa Plastics Project for Greenpeace Africa. And this is not Amos, this is Gerance Mutual. Gerance is stepping in for Amos, who unfortunately couldn't make it because of other commitments, and Gerance is a plastics campaigner for Greenpeace. So Helen and Gerance will speak to fossil fuels and the plastics crisis. Seble will speak on the need for an international instrument to stop the expansion of fossil fuels and ensuring just transitions. She's also an expert on fossil fuels, so any questions that you had for Amos, she's very willing to take on that in spite of that smile. So we'll begin immediately. Thank you for your time. Hope the stream is up and running. If you're ready, we will start with Gerance, who will give us his opening statement.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session. In recent years, the world has faced three most pressing environmental issues, and this is climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, simply referred as the triple planetary crisis. All these crises have different causes and effects, but one thing is common among all these crises, which is plastics pollution. So as we gather here today and this week for the UNEA-6 to deliberate how corporations, aka multilateralism, can help tackle the triple planetary crisis, the plastics crisis should not be forgotten. I think you've seen attempts to separate plastics away from the resolutions, mainly on the sound management of chemicals and circularity and synergistic approach. But it's high time we understand the magnitude of this crisis and how plastics is fueling the climate crisis and also the triple planetary crisis. So I'll just give a simple introduction of how plastics affects the triple, or I can say exacerbates these three triple planetary crises. So we can start with climate crisis. So I don't know if everyone knows this, but 99% of plastics ever produced comes from fossil fuel. Basically, raw material of making plastics is fossil fuel. And we know fossil fuel are the major culprit that creates the climate crisis. So in each and every stage of plastics production, we get gases, greenhouse gases, and other emissions being released to the atmosphere, and this exacerbates the climate crisis. And when we talk about biodiversity loss, I don't know if every one of us have seen those videos of turtles being choked by plastics. We've seen like whales and big fish being washed into the shore, and when their bellies are popped up, you find the plastics inside them. And during, for example, in Cape Town, when they were about to do the seismic blasting, that would affect the biodiversity in there. And right now, even in the Congo Basin forest, these precinct forests are being cleared or about to be cleared because they're being auctioned for exploration of oil, which we've said like now, oil is feedstocks to plastics. So that's how plastics are really affecting this biodiversity loss. And when you talk about pollution, I feel like it's not something that I need to introduce to you all. If you just get out of here, drive or take an Uber or walk a few minutes from here, you find River Nairobi. And once you get to River Nairobi, the only thing that you'll see is plastics. And we've seen in so many cases that during rainy season, floods and affects our communities. And when you open the drainages, you find plastics. So this is how plastics have really affected how we live. But at this important moment at UNEA, it's a make or break type of situation. We need to make sure that we incorporate plastics and its effects to the triple planetary crisis, and to make sure that our leaders who are here today, the delegates who are here today, and this week, they put preference to this and continue to put these triple planetary crises not away from plastics. And what is the urgency of the matter? We need to reduce the production of plastics, but at least 75% by 2040. And these technically will elevate all these triple planetary crises. And in turn, this will reduce oil exploration activities, halt linear consumerism way of living, stop plastics pollution, and restore our precinct biodiversity. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerance. So then we can't speak about ending fossil fuels without ending plastics. Kahaso, what's your statement to carry forward from what Gerance has said.
Thank you, Ferdinand. Good afternoon, members of the press and everyone present. Plastic production is closely linked to the fossil fuel industry, primarily through the extraction and processing of petrochemicals. As my colleague Jonas has said, over 99% of plastics begin as a fossil fuel. And in each and every stage of the plastic's life cycle, greenhouse gases are emitted, and thus further driving the climate crisis. The energy-intensive process of converting petrochemicals into plastics contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. As the demand for plastics therefore continues to grow, so does the need for fossil fuels. And this has increased emissions and also accelerating the climate change. While we're making a shift from fossil fuels towards cleaner energy sources, the fossil fuel industry now sees single-use plastics as a lifeline and is actively directing substantial financial investment towards expanding plastic production. This is in response to increasing the demand for plastics. Should we fail to curtail both production and the use of plastics, we will find ourselves unable to break free from our dependence on fossil fuels, along with the detrimental consequences they pose on the environment, oceans, community, and human health. Presently, plastic contributes to about 3 to 4% of the global gas emissions. And if this trend persists, this figure is poised to triple by the year 2050. If no measures are taken, plastic production is set to quadruple by 2050. The growing plastic production is a major problem for communities, not just in Africa, but across the globe. Plastic production has particularly been shown to have harsh impact on low-income and marginalized communities. Most of these, live in sub-Saharan Africa. These adverse effects, health effects, are stemming from the petrochemical plants, landfills, contaminated water bodies, and the incineration of plastic waste. I bet a number of you have seen this in the informal settlements where plastic is used to boil water and even as fuel for cooking for different families. Yet, major corporations are disregarding all these consequences and evading their accountability. Unfortunately, oil-producing nations acting on behalf of big oil and petrochemical corporations dominate and obstruct or dilute the ongoing global plastic treaty negotiations in a bid to diminish its ambition. So we are urging member states to do everything in their power to champion a treaty that prioritizes cuts in production for our health, the climate, and the planet. The Global Plastic Treaty must therefore reduce plastic production by at least 75% by 2040 to ensure that we are avoiding the worst impacts of the climate crisis. We cannot protect our climate, our biodiversity, our health, and curb pollution unless we reduce plastic production. Therefore, going into INC4 in Canada this April, we hope to see bold and more ambitious actions from the High Ambition Coalition, but also including the African group of countries. And this is in a bid to put an immediate cap on plastic production in the struggle to ultimately end this crisis. So member states need to forge a way forward without fossil fuel producers dictating the terms of the negotiations. For the sake of our future, that of our children, we cannot afford to waste this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to ultimately end this plastic crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Hasso. Once-in-a-lifetime treaty. And now we have the fossil fuel treaty, a non-proliferation treaty initiative. Seble is here. And, you brought together countries who aim to end the age of coal, oil, and gas. And maybe your opening statement hopefully includes why we do need a fossil fuel treaty. Your turn.
Thank you so much, and hello, everyone. I hope you're doing well this afternoon. Thank you for having me. I'm Sabla Samuel from the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, head of Africa campaigns based in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. So thank you so much to Gerance and Helen for setting the scene. I want to reiterate that there are 3 substances that have driven around 90% of carbon emissions in the last decade. And these 3 substances drive both the plastics crises and the fossil fuel crises, or the climate crises. And these are coal, oil, and gas. And despite being the leading driver of the climate crisis, they are completely absent from our international climate policy. They have become geniuses in making themselves be invisible in our negotiations, despite being the main driver of this crisis. So we ask ourselves, how are we going to address a global crisis if we're not dealing with the root cause? We saw for the first time at COP28 that fossil fuels were finally dragged center stage, and we saw the mention of the need to transition away from fossil fuels. But we know that we need so much more than this. We need a binding plan, which is the proposal that comes from the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, riding on the shoulders of the entire End Fossil Fuels movement and the call for renewable energy that is just and that is equitable. And why do we need this? As I was saying, the Paris Agreement, while it's powerful in bringing all countries to the room, getting important calls like the Loss and Damage Fund, and getting the 1.5 target, these are essential. And we need to complement this treaty complement the Paris Agreement with the proposed fossil fuel treaty to really have a managed decline of fossil fuel production in a way that is fair and fast and financed. What has happened because we currently lack a framework? Countries are on track to produce 110% more fossil fuels between now and 2030 than what we can safely burn to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. This is a massive overshoot, and it's happening because there is no framework to rein in this production, and it's leading us to dangerous overshoots of our climate targets. And so there's 3 pillars that ground the proposed fossil fuel treaty. There's a pillar on the just transition, so unlocking finance and technology for economic diversification, for development alternatives, and for renewable energy deployment, and training for fossil fuel workers to be part of the renewable economy. There is a pillar on non-proliferation, which is no new expansion for coal, oil, and gas anywhere on this planet, because even the current operating projects of fossil fuels are set to overshoot our carbon budget. And we have a pillar on a fair phase out. What does this mean? This means that countries like the US and Canada and the UK and Norway and Germany and Australia, who have driven us into the climate crisis, need to phase out their production first and fastest, and give support to countries like Angola, Nigeria, Iraq, Ecuador, whose economies are entrenched in fossil fuels and need international cooperation and finance and technology to make that transition. The fossil fuel crisis and the climate crisis does not respect borders, and we need an international response for this. And there's been momentum building to support this call for a fossil fuel treaty since it kicked off a few years ago. There are now 12 nation states who are backing the proposal, including 2 major fossil fuel producers, Timor-Leste and Colombia, recently joined at COP28. They see that the world is shifting away from fossil fuels, and it is economic suicide to continue having undiversified monopolies on fossil fuels. And we have thousands of organizations around the world and institutions like the European Parliament, the World Health Organization are championing this call. There's 100 cities and subnational governments on every single continent in this world. There's faith leaders that we even have in this room today who are backing the call. We have thousands of young people, hundreds of parliamentarians, and thousands of academics and hundreds of Nobel laureates. So this momentum is growing every day, and there's evident need for this transition to happen. This has been backed by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UNEP, whose headquarters we sit in today, who are in fact the ones that drafted this production gap report that shows this massive overshoot of 110% more fossil fuels being planned in the coming years. As well as the International Energy Agency, who has said there is no room for new fossil fuel investments in our net zero pathways. And now I'm going to pretend that I'm Amos for 1 or 2 minutes because he couldn't be with us today.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. And I want to say what this means for the African continent because I campaign on the African continent. This is where we are today, and also where I live. Because we hear this myth every single day. If you're stopping fossil fuels on the continent, aren't you stopping development? So I want to just be sober in this response. about how fossil fuels have actually underdeveloped this continent. We have had decades of fossil fuel extraction, and where has that left us? This is a continent with 600 million people who lack energy access. It's a continent with 950 million people inhaling toxic fuels every single day because they don't have access to clean cooking. And it has made sub-Saharan Africa an energy poverty hotspot because 75% of the world's population living without electricity is right here. In addition to that, we do not even own our energy. 60% of the fossil fuel operations on this continent are headquartered abroad, majority in Europe. Does this sound like a neo-colonization of the energy industry? You can ask yourselves. The majority is destined for export. For example, 90% of the current liquid natural gas operations on this continent, over 90% is destined for export. We have energy poor countries like Mozambique with 70% of the population that lacks access to energy. That energy is being exported. And we have more than 70% of the population of projected oil and gas projects that are at risk of becoming stranded assets, so lost finance. I will wrap up in my Amos role in 1 second. I also want to highlight that major producers like Nigeria have 85 million people that do not have access to energy or the energy grid. And it's actually the country with the highest energy access deficit in the world. That's our major producer on the continent, right? And they actually import 100% of their gasoline. So they export the crude oil, they import the refined gasoline. That's causing energy deficits. We're importing inflation, and we're importing debt. And this is happening on the continent with the highest renewable energy potential in the world. We have almost 40% of the global share, 60% of the best solar resources, and yet this is largely untapped. So I want to use this metaphor that the wonderful Tunisian economist Fadel Kaboub always uses, which is, if we're going to say we have the right to development, it's precisely because we have the right to free ourselves from this fossil fuel entrapment that has not powered our continent. And it's to imagine 100 years ago when the world was shifting to automobiles. It's as if they're saying to us now, you have the right to development. You need to stay with the horse and cart. The entire world is shifting to renewable energy. There's no reason for us to further entrench ourselves in a fossil fuel model that has done nothing to power our continent or our economies while the world shifts away. We actually have a huge potential to be a leader in this transition, and we hope that the Fossil Fuel Treaty can be one of the contributing pathways to get to that transition. Thank you.
Thank you, Seble. So I have lots of questions. But you have questions too, I'm sure. So I'll let you ask first. Anyone? Corey behind there has a mic. Oh. So you'll start by introducing yourself and where you're from, and then direct your questions to either of the speakers.
Question is for Seble. You mentioned the fossil fuel entrapment, and currently, as the world is moving away from fossil fuels into renewable energy, we are seeing some of the indicators that this could, the same imbalances and the same kind of export-import dynamics that you spoke about could recreate themselves. So, specifically with regard to critical minerals and metals that fuel the transition, what would be ways of ensuring that this dynamic is not recreated?
I think we'll take maybe 2 more questions and then you can respond. Yes.
My name is Leon Lidigu from Nation Media Group. I have 2 questions for Seble. Number 1, how are you going to ensure that things are different this time, considering during Stockholm Plus 50, we had these same conversations about lowering emissions and all those things, and the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is very important at this point. But every time we have these conferences, we always have the least ambitious countries in the driver's seat. How are we going to achieve anything? Are we fooling ourselves? Because during INC3, I was here when, for the first time in my life, I saw USA and Russia agree on something. and that was to get rid of a plastic treaty and frustrate those efforts completely. Saudi Arabia is also around. They are busy doing what they do best. How are we dealing with them? Thank you.
One more question.
Hi, my name is Alba and I work for RFI, the French Public Radio. For anyone who wants to answer, for this week with 19 draft resolutions, is there any that stands out to you, provides a little bit of hope that you feel could be strong if it was passed? Or do you feel like something stronger is need to come?
You will take that? Yeah. All right, so we can start with Seble and then Gerance can answer.
Okay, thank you for your question, Caroline. Definitely, the transition is happening faster than we had planned and also in a chaotic way, currently not in a managed decline or transition. And so the fossil fuel treaty and the just transition pillar is proposing safeguards and principles that actually need to underpin this transition. I think there's the potential, obviously, there's been cases of deep human rights abuses that we've seen on this continent. We've also seen in Latin America in the lithium triangle and all of the mining for lithium batteries for solar, for electric vehicles, for example. And we want, obviously, the situation to be completely different in the transition that we hopefully can manage towards renewable energy that happens in a way that's ecologically sustainable, but also respects human rights. So the idea is to develop the principles, and we'll have a set of regional consultations also to happen, that can define how this shift towards critical mineral extraction does not replicate the same kind of injustices and extractivism that's happened with the fossil fuel economy. We do not want to have a replication of renewable energy extractivism on this massive scale that depletes the planet, as has been with fossil fuels. So we need to have distributed systems, localized cooperative systems that are community owned, and not having these massive scale, Shell, Chevron, Eni, Total just become the owners of these critical mineral mining. So there's also possibilities to have green industrialization pathways for the continent, because right now what's been happening is we export raw materials. These go to other countries which process and manufacture them, and that final industrial product is what's sold back to us. And that keeps us in a trade deficit where we're basically exporting the cheap goods and we're importing the refined goods. So it does not matter how much we increase our export, we will constantly be importing debt and inflation. So we want to have potentially a regional bloc for this continent, but Latin America could have a similar model if they want. I'm floating ideas here. There could be a potential of a moratorium on the export of critical minerals from this continent, so we actually develop it here. And we want to make sure that industrialization happens here and that we're just not serving another continent's industrialization plan. And the question around the least ambitious countries, we do not want the least ambitious countries to form the initial bloc of the countries that negotiate a mandate for the fossil fuel treaty. Right now, we are targeting countries whose policies align with the fossil fuel treaty. So either they have strong renewable energy policies, or they have policies around keeping fossil fuels in the ground, as we've seen, like the proposals from Colombia and Timor-Leste that have said, if we can have an international framework that mobilizes finance and technology, we don't want to keep exporting. There's countries like Ecuador who export because they owe a debt to China, and they don't owe that debt in money, they owe that debt in oil. So we want to have a framework that can have proposals around debt cancellation, reform of the financial architecture that doesn't keep these countries entrapped, as I mentioned before with the fossil fuel entrapment. We want the initial group of countries to be the most ambitious on climate, precisely because we don't want this to be derailed by the biggest fossil fuel polluters in the world.
Gerance, before you speak, I just have a follow-up question, especially for Kahaso with the low ambition countries, because I've seen an email here, which explains that already we're seeing, some countries, I don't know if I can name them, I won't, we are sort of backtracking on already agreed language about ending plastic pollution with a 2040 deadline. So the problems that Africa has faced, especially with dealing with pollution, particularly plastics. From where you see it going into to negotiate, then how is important or how possible it is to get a multilateral agreement to sort of arrive at the solutions which will be for the good of the continent?
Thank you, Ferdinand. I think just speaking from what Seble was speaking about, the countries with low ambition countries, and we've seen this trend even during INC3, where a lot of, not a lot, but a few, countries which are big oil producers really trying to derail these negotiations. And I think a call for the high ambition countries to really stand their ground, because we're talking about a crisis here, which is not just an environmental crisis, but one that also impacts on our health, impacts on the future of our children. So it's up to the other countries not to allow these few low ambition countries or in the treaty plastics treaty negotiation, they are calling themselves like-minded countries, to not really derail this process, because this is the only chance we have to stem this pollution. And a lot of the time it has to do with them focusing on the really plastic waste, as opposed to looking at the entire life cycle, which is from production. Because if we don't cap production, if we don't look at how do we reduce production, then we will be in talks, we will go through all the 5 INCs, and at the end of the day, come up with a treaty which will be, which will have low ambitions, which will not be able to solve this crisis. So my call, and just to answer your question, I think it's up to those countries that are really what we call the high ambition countries. And in this, I want to specifically, urge the African governments here, because if you look at Africa, we are not really a major producer of plastics, for instance, but look at all the consequences that we are suffering from, including, West colonialism, where, rich countries come to Africa and dump plastic waste. So it's a problem that we all need to come together, but I think we also need to stand firm as member states, but also other stakeholders, so that we are not just putting profits before people and the planet.
Thanks, Kahaso. I think that segues nicely into Gerance's answering questions for Alban. How do we get to the Holy Grail?
Thank you. So to answer Alban, I'll focus to the resolutions that I've been following, because there's so many and you cannot be everywhere. First, I can say the open-ended committee of permanent representative. You can't hear me? Can you hear me now? Cool. The open-ended committee of permanent representative that happened last, the past week, was not really successful, I can say, because not all resolutions were even fully read and negotiated word by word as expected. But maybe I can give an overview of just the 3 that I was following, which is the sound management of chemicals and waste, which was read up to the end. This one was presented by Switzerland. And so I think you can see from INC, the Global Plastics Treaty, we have part of chemicals and polymers of concerns. And this was more of a point of interest to me. But definitely, as our colleague from Nation said, there's been those back and forth because of the Low Ambition Coalition or the like-minded team to water down this and trying to break the link between climate and chemicals, and that didn't really stand out really well for some of us. Another thing that I followed on was a synergistic approach. This basically was brought up by Japan, and it also wanted to link plastics pollution to biodiversity loss and also the climate crisis, and also that received a little bit of backlash. And the last one was circularity, which basically is being watered down each and every day as we continue talking. But I'm not a prophet of doom, but I'm not so sure if there's anything that concrete that will come out of the UNEA-6.
So, okay, that's interesting, because so what are we doing here? Anyway, before they answer that, I just want to make sure, because we only have about 10 minutes or 8 to ask questions. Any other round of questions from the floor? Good. So my question, if we are not positive, again, the question is, what are we doing here? Why all these conferences? Why all these meetings? Why spend so much only for us to say, you know what, we're just trying. Why are we really here? What do you really hope to achieve out of this? What is the best case scenario for you? Is there a silver lining at all?
To answer your question, it's not like we are not doing anything here. I feel like each and every conversation starts something, and I would say like it's a first step for us to see that who are with us in this fight to make sure that you have a safe and cleaner planet. So it kind of set a stage of where you want to see like, yes, we are pro and we are against. And this will help us to also continue to engage them and also help them to understand these agents of the crisis.
And of course, one of the biggest debates, Seble, has been about just transition, which is something also you're working on. And I'm just wondering, especially for countries which are heavily reliant on fossil fuels, how then can they be brought into the conversation in such a way that we can come to, well, not a middle ground because we have to do away with fossil fuels, but then how do we bring them in to the conversation that they feel involved in the overall decision-making process so that they do not become a stumbling block?
Thank you. So I think I've shared already that out of the 12 initial nation states that are backing the call for the fossil fuel treaty, 2 of them are major fossil fuel producers. I'll repeat, they're Timor-Leste and Colombia, who have significant fossil fuel extraction, and this makes up a large portion of their exports and therefore foreign revenue. But these countries have been clear that they want to join the fossil fuel treaty because they understand that the economy is shifting away from fossil fuels, that global demand is falling for fossil fuels, and it is economically foolish to continue to have undiversified economies that are based on fossil fuels if the world is shifting away from these sources. Of course, also from a climate standpoint, a health standpoint, a human rights standpoint, but also in addition from an economics perspective, it does not make financial sense. So these countries have joined, and we encourage more to do so, especially the fossil fuel dependent developing nations, because finance and technology will be required to make this transition. Countries like Iraq, who have almost 90% of their national revenue coming from oil, are not going to shift away from oil if there's not an international cooperation framework to make that possible, that comes funded and with open technology transfers for them to power new economies. So the text of the fossil fuel treaty has not been written. It's the countries that come on board and join first that can shape the terms and the agreements that position this treaty itself. So we encourage those that are dependent on fossil fuels yet want to diversify away to also join this call. And it's a coalition of the willing and the most ambitious. We want to have a good geographical diversity and also representation between producers and non-producers. So we welcome them to come on this journey and this call for the fossil fuel treaty, and understand that their early kind of joining of this initiative will also give them the role to shape the terms of what this treaty becomes.
Yes, and Kahaso, also when you look towards events like pollution and biodiversity loss, we cannot have this conversation without involving the communities, because they're the ones who suffer the most. They're the ones who feel, get the short end of the stick. And I was not watching really, I followed the Super Bowl, the halftime show, really. But at the end of it, we saw that, big governments and big celebrities, they were all flying out in these huge jets, one person on an entire plane, and I just saw a tweet from somebody saying that, look at these people's carbon footprint, but it is I who is expected to drink my soda from a soggy stick, So when this happens, I just wonder from your perspective, how then do we get local communities, the people, to care about this and also hold governments and the blockers accountable so that we can get this thing moving forward, because we cannot achieve this without the power of the people?
Thank you, Fadi. Before I come to the communities, I first want to, just reiterate what Sabla was saying, but rather bring it back home. I think as Africa, we need to, reimagine a future and a sustainable, alternative away from fossil fuels. If you look at, Africa, we have an abundance of renewable energy, but for some reason, somebody has quote unquote bewitched us to think that we can only develop if we extract oil and every other metal that we have. We already facing the impacts of the climate crisis. Recently, we had Cyclone Freddy in southern, Africa, claiming more than 1,000 people and destroying, thousands, destroying property worth, thousands of, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now, back to the community, I think as much as we're focusing on the need for climate action from governments and all big oil, as communities, we also have a role to play. And I will just give an example when it comes to things like plastic pollution. It might not seem as much, but every time you carry, a reusable bottle, such as what Seble have here, you are actually contributing to less plastics footprint, plastic waste actually, instead of just using a plastic bottle. So this is to say that we need collective, responsibility, and not just the communities, Fadi. We also want to call on big business, because these are the people who have the resources. They can invest in, research and development. They can also invest in, looking at some of the sustainable alternatives that will also bring into the table in order for us to be able to deal with this crisis. So it is a collective responsibility at the end of the day.
Yes, there was a journalist who had indicated he had questions in Kiswahili. Ikiwa bado uko hapa, uwanja ni wako. Or you can see us immediately after this. Oh, he's here. Oh, please, mpe tafadhali.
Asante. Naitwa Victor Mutule kutoka RFI Kiswahili Nairobi. Pengine kuna uliza kuhusu masuala ya mafuta ya visukuku, kwamba tumekuwa tukijadili swala hili nenda rudi hadi sasa hivi. Je, sasa tufanye nini? Kwa sababu mambo tumeweza kuzungumzia kila wakati, na mwaka ujao pengine tukutana hapa mambo kama hayo. Tupatie mwelekeo mwafaka ambao tukitoka hapa mwaka ujao tuzungumzie jambo lingine.
Asante kwa swali hilo. Nikijibu tu kwa kifupi ni kwamba yale mataifa ambayo yanatengeneza mafuta ya kisukusu, kuna yale mataifa makubwa, kwa kweli yani yamekita mizizi katika mazungumzo, na si haya tu, mazungumzo mengi tu, na lengo lao ni kama ni moja, kuona ya kwamba mazungumzo haya yanadorora. Tumeona katika mazungumzo ya kukomesha uchafuzi wa mazingira kwa plastiki, tumeona katika mazungumzo pia ya mabadilifu ya tabia nchi. Kwa hivyo ni kama hilo huwa ndio lengo lao, na hata siwezi kuhakikishia kuwa mwaka ujao hawatakuwa hapa tena. Ambalo naweza kuhakikishia ni kuwa watakuwa hapa tena na lengo lao litakuwa lile. Kwa hivyo kwetu sisi tunahimiza yale yani zile nchi zingine ama yale mabara mengine ambao wanataka kuendelea kwa haya mazungumzo, wasimame kidete, wasiwache mataifa mawili matatu kuona kwamba hii kazi yote haitakuwa ya maana, isidorore kwa sababu mataifa mawili matatu yanataka kuleta kurudisha mazungumzo haya nyuma. Kwa hivyo tutaendelea tu kupambana nayo. Kwa ufupi, sidhani kama watamaliza haya mazungumzo hapa na waseme basi tumewachana nayo. Hilo sioni likifanyika, lakini kwetu sisi pia kama wanaharakati tutazidi kuwahimiza kuwa waangalie madhara ya mabadiliko ya tabia nchi, madhara ya uchafuzi wa mazingira kutumia plastiki. Wasiangalie tu mambo ya faida na pesa ambazo zinatoka na mafuta haya ya kisukusu. Asante.
Shukran Kahaso. Najua wengi wenu umejifunza neno mapya, maneno mapya, kwa mfano mafuta ya sukusuku. Lakini la muhimu ni kwamba tutazidi kubanana nao kwenye mazungumzo. And that brings us to to the end of this presser. We thank you very much for coming. There's a press pack from the Fossil Fuel and Proliferation Treaty Initiative. You can have a copy, and then you can also get one from me from Greenpeace Africa. I've also sent an online press release. If you want to reach out to me, please get me an email at fomondi@greenpeace.org. That's fomondi@greenpeace.org. And if you still want one-on-one interviews, please see us after this. But thank you so much for your time, and I wish you a blessed day.